Hello, everyone. This is Zeynep. I do coordination for Amber platform for amberNetworkFestival this year. Welcome, Öznur. Hello.
Hello, Zeynep.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
I will say a few words about this year's festival first. Amber Network Festival this year, in a very special time, is truly decentralized and international, with a collective creation process and performance with network members and the artists they invite. From Berlin, Istanbul, İzmir, Tehran, Shiraz, Casablanca, Khartoum, Baalbek, Bishkek, and Cairo. Artistic directors are Ekmel Ertan from Amber Platform and Nina Martin from Oyun. Co-curators and lab leaders are Christoph Wacher and Matthias Jud. Amber Network Festival is produced by Oyun Berlin in collaboration with Amber Platform, Istanbul, funded by Berlin Senes Hauptstadt Kulturfond. And before letting the floor to you, Öznur, maybe I can say a few words about you as well.
Please.
Öznur Karakaş, she's graduated from Boğaziçi University, Translation Studies department. She received a master's degree in Philosophy University. And then Prague Charles University and Toulouse Jean Jaurès universities within the framework of the Europhilosophy Master Erasmus Mundus program. She worked on sexual difference in Deleuze and Deleuze-Guattari philosophy, and she worked on community embodiment and assemblage in Gezi movement in the interdisciplinary department of information and knowledge society at Universitat Oberta de Catalunya at the end of 2018. It's a study. So she is a translator in French, Spanish, and English language. And she is also the founding editor of the digital magazine called Terabyte. Yes, thank you. I'm very excited for the workshop, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zeynep. I'm really delighted to be a part of this great organization. It is a completely international and interdisciplinary organization. It's really, really exciting to be here and to be talking about this theme in those days, especially in those pandemic times. It is really significant to be talking about this, I guess, post-digital ignorance, and from the point of view that I am planning to introduce, as we are also starting to discuss, we have already started to discuss that we entered a new geological era. It is not officially accepted yet, but there are lots of geophysicians who are talking about this, starting from the beginning of 2000. We are talking about Anthropocene, the era in which human activity has irrevocably changed the earth. And it's quite telling in a certain way what we understand from nature now and what we understand from natural and artificial now, especially also when we take a look at all the technologies we have in the advanced capitalism that blur the lines between what is natural and what is artificial. So I'm particularly interested in that. That's the reason why I am also interested in the artwork of Marta de Menezes, Ebru Yetişkin, one of the creators of Amberfest. She did introduce her to me in her work in Akbank, in Aksanat, and I had a chance to listen to her work in Istanbul. It's quite interesting the way she works with new technologies and the way she works with technologies like gene editing, the CRISPR-Cas9 as we call it. And I studied a little bit more on her work, and also I will be talking a little bit about one of the examples of her projects, and then a little bit about 3D technology and bioprinting, as we call it, and then I will invite, this is a workshop, so I'm thinking about inviting our participants to tell their opinions about what they think about this, so to say, entanglement between what we might say natural and artificial. And then I'm planning to shift to the contributions, the new materialist contributions in the feminist and queer theory. Taking a critical approach towards what we call the cultural turn in social sciences, starting from the 1990s, more or less. So we are nowadays talking about a material turn instead, and we have witnessed the emergence of new materialist approaches in science and technology studies and in feminist and queer studies. And I am particularly interested in them, and I'm also particularly interested in their criticism of emergence for the feminist theory. So we can start with the first part of the presentation. Natural from artificial or cultural was a modern attempt to discursively delineate what nature and what type of nature we do create in our discursive practices. So I like this quotation because she mentions that advanced capitalism is already a post-humanist state. So she says in the Anthropocene Feminism, in her article in Anthropocene Feminism, that the technologically mediated world is neither organic, inorganic, male, female, nor especially white. Advanced capitalism is a post-gender system capable of accommodating a high degree of androgyny and a significant blurring of the categorical divide between the sexes. It is also a post-racial system that no longer classifies people and their cultures on grounds of pigmentation, but remains nonetheless profoundly racist. A strong theory of post-human subjectivity can help us to reappropriate these processes, both theoretically and politically, not only as analytical tools, but also as alternative ground for formations of the self. So starting from this claim that being in a post-state and promoted by them would be an apt way to start our discussion or our workshop about nature culture and the divide between the two in those post-digital times. And I want to start with this truly natural project of Marta de Menezes. It dates back to 2018. So she particularly uses CRISPR-Cas9 technology to remove transgenes from a genetically modified organism. So the question is, and here it would be better to show the picture. So the thing is here, the interesting thing is, like, she's more natural than. So we already have a genetically modified mice, and then using that technology, we are returning it back to this so-called wild state. So by using more technology, with more and more technological mediation, we are having a more, so to say, natural product, a more natural organism. So this in itself tells us what and how and in what ways our understanding of natural and artificial have gone in a crisis these days. Because, like, if we understand that what is natural is something that is not mediated, something that is away or outside of human mediation or technology or techniques, this shows us that by way of using technology, we are getting a more, so to say, natural result. And I kind of liked this idea and the way she plays in between that distinction between artificial and natural, and how something more natural might come out of more and more artificiality. And I really like this irony. So she says that the truly natural takes advantage of CRISPR-Cas9. This is the gene editing technology, which is also inspired from bacterial genome editing technologies, if we can call them, but we will throughout the course of this presentation. So she uses technology to edit the genome of a genetically modified organism in order to revert it to the wild type status. So the artwork consists in a genetically altered organism with a genome where nothing artificial can be found. So at the end of this process, with the help of the technology, it goes back to its, so to say, natural status and position. So the genome editing here is intended to remove the prior genetic intervention because it was already genetically modified. So this work creates a tension arising from the idea that a complex genomic intervention can lead to a natural organism, or rather something simultaneously natural and artificial. So I like this as an example to blur the lines between what we understand from artificial and what we understand from natural. And like we have all those types of examples in the very sciences, in the very biotechnologies that we have today. One of the examples is, I think our audience is also aware of it, xenotransplantation. What is that? It is the practice of using living animal organs, tissues, and cells as medical transplants in human recipients, and generally we use the gene of pigs. And the gene editing technology known as CRISPR-Cas9, the same technology, is currently being used to create human-pig hybrids, and they are called chimera. And they're allowed to develop 28 weeks before being killed. Of course, we have all sorts of ethical questions here, creating all those chimeras to kill them at the end of 28 weeks and to harness their tissues calls forth significant ethical problems. But I just here I suffice it to refer to the situation we are in, this hybrid situation that we are in, and our technologies are already investing a lot on this hybridity. Another example is nanobots, and Luciana Parisi mentions a lot about them, nanotechnology. So nanobot is a popular term for molecules with a unique property that enables them to be programmed to carry out a specific task. And the most popular example of this is this drug delivery into our own body, the smart delivery. So with the help of them, we can deliver the drug and the active material in it to the tissues themselves. And it is much more efficient that way. And like they are called, like the Luciana Parisi has a very nice way to work on that idea and work on nanotechnologies and calling them as a means to have virtual interventions and create changes at the virtual domain with reference to Deleuze and Guattari. And she calls that the assemblers, the nanosystems, modulate chemical behavior of atoms. So they change basically the position of atoms in a certain setting and situation. And for her, assemblers are general purpose devices capable of redirecting and directing chemical reactions by positioning molecules in a certain way and thus enabling their specific replication. And nanomachines can rearrange the position of every atom. So she calls them molecular designing machines. And for instance, we have cell repair machines to reassemble patterns of atoms that cause cancer. Another example, one that I like and one that I got interested in for some time, is bioprinted organic matter, like bioprinting technology. It is basically the application of 3D printing in organic matter. So the question of what is natural and what is artificial gets even more blurry in those examples, because what happens is that this is a biological variant of the resin transsource 3D printing, like small scale and layer by layer manufacturing of computer designed forms or prototypes. So it is not it's not subtractive, meaning that we are not subtracting manufacturing via subtraction from a raw material. It is like we are layer by layer adding new materials based on a certain computer-based prototype. And now with the 3D printing applied to bioprinting and material, we see that the organic material is recreated and by using additive manufacturing technology. So like successive layers of material are created until the entire object appears from a prototype. And Vermeulen works a lot on that, and the intention of bioprinting is to work with organic materials. So we're not working with inorganic material, but we are working with organic materials, and including living cells and stem cells especially, to create structures approximating body parts. So we have not been able to create a whole organ, but we have created hard walls and tissues. Specialized bioprinters use biological inks, so bioinks they call them, like differentiated human embryonic or induced pluripotent stem cells to print 3D constructs composed of living organic material. So like here, it's a very interesting domain because we have all types of also ethical and legal questions. We don't have enough legal regulations to differentiate between to understand whether we can apply the already existing patents or copyright regulations on the bioprinted organic materials. So it is made out of my own stem cells. Do I own it? Is it part of my body, or is it just a product to be marketed? So these questions have started to arise, and like there are also ethical questions behind them. There are legal questions. And also questions regarding the copyrights, like who owns it, and whether they are techniques, like whether they are surgical techniques or they are products in themselves. So this area is quite interesting, but for the purposes of this presentation and this workshop, I just want to mention how they blur the line between what we call natural and artificial. Between a product, a manufactured product, an artificial product, and a natural organism or a bio object, as it is called. So like you see, like we can create hard walls, we can create air, and I have also participated in the research groups in Uppsala University and also the research group at Life, and they have been talking about the means to get different materials to create bone structures, for instance. They are using them in reconstructive surgeries, and they are making bones out of it. This is pretty interesting, and like what is philosophically interesting for me for sure is this blurring the line between natural and artificial, and this is quite important. So what matter are we talking about now? Is it the nature that we have already known? Is it the nature that we posited to be outside of ourselves? Is it the nature that we deemed to be outside reality? Or is it a different kind of nature? Or what type of matter are we talking about? What is matter in that sense? What is organic and inorganic matter? What is the relationship between the two of them? So all those questions are reconsidered under those new technologies, but they have already started to be discussed in philosophy. So like I really like this quotation from Stacy Alaimo in her book called Bodily Natures, and like matter, I'm quoting from her, the vast stuff of the world and of ourselves has been subdivided into manageable bits or flattened into a blank state for human inscription. This has always been what we understand from nature or matter, right? Like the blank slate, like out there for us to use, out there for us to inscribe our cultural marks or our symbolic marks. So the environment has been drained of its blood. It is lively creatures, it is interactions and relations. In short, all that is recognizable is nature, in order that it become a mere empty space, an uncontested ground, and this is the name of her previous book, for human development. If nature is to matter, if nature is to become important for us, we need more potent, more complex understandings of materiality. So we can consider this as the basic premise of new materiality and all the urge towards new materiality. We need more potent and more complex understandings of materiality. We need to leave behind this understanding that nature is out there-ness, ready to be culturally inscribed, ready for the purpose of human enhancement or development. So the idea behind all this, the idea behind also this presentation, for me, the idea behind a reconsideration of what nature might mean is that we enter this period, and this is also the theme of our festival this year, the post-digital and digitalization and all the technologies that come from digitalization put us in a more urgent state to reconsider those problems and those questions. And why queer and which queer is the question that I now would like to ask before passing to the more theoretical part of the presentation. But before going there, I would just like to ask, as it's a workshop and as it is intended to be interactive, I just want to ask the audience if they want to say something about this, if there are anything that they would like to say, or any contributions or any questions, remarks. It is 2:30. We have an hour and a half. So I'm leaving the floor to our participants if they would like to add something, say something. If not, we can shift to the, or you can also write them on the chat, or we can give the floor to you. Like, it's difficult to have workshops online, right? Like, if we were face to face, it would be easier. Like, we could just talk to each other, but it's more difficult. Like the mediation, all this mediation really goes through. Yeah.
Maybe if the ones who want to turn on their cameras, they can.
Yeah, I mean, like, yes. Yes, I mean, it would be better if, like, for the people who want to pose a question or who want to contribute.
Yes. Maybe no pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. No pressure. Maybe at the end of the more theoretical part, we will have more discussions.
Yeah.
But it's okay if not. Yeah, so the question is, like, why queer theory and which queer are we talking about? So I just wanted to refer to that there are different understandings of queer, there are different understandings of queer theory, but now I refer to Myer Hert's understanding, like the way she defines queer and the way she defines its importance for our understanding of non-human life or nature itself. In her book called, this is an edited volume, it is really good, I really like that book, Queering the Non-Human from 2008. So it's good to use it because it provisionally characterizes uses of the word queer, and ambivalence marks attachments to it as an identity category, political positionality, methodological framework, or system of knowledge production. So here we have an emphasis on the ambivalence that is attributed to identity categories and identities. And the second definition is refers to Dean Shaw, the continual unhinging of certainties and the systemic disturbing of the familiar. So queer has the sense of disturbing the familiar, the normative structures and the identities, the established fixed identities. The touch of the queer has uncanny, disillusioning, demystifying effects, with queer itself becoming altered in the process of denaturalizing its objects. And a third definition is about the emphasis of queer theoretical work on fluidity, uber-inclusivity, indeterminacy, indefinability, unknowability, the preposterous, impossibility, unthinkability, unintelligibility, meaninglessness, and that which is unrepresentable. So I really like this one because I wanted to put that here because, like, this is also one of our topics in the festival, right? Like unthinkability, impossibility, unintelligibility. Like post-digital ignorance includes all of those themes, which will also be tackled by other contributors. And also there's an important sense of unrepresentability in queer theory when we take a look at the theory of Judith Butler. And I will also be talking about that. And when we take a look at Judith Butler's theory of queer, which is profoundly and in many fruitful ways criticized by the material queer theorists, we see that the nature is also the unrepresentable nature out there. We see that there is a certain inaccessibility towards it, and hence the name of the presentation, Ignorance Fairies. So fairy has the sense of an aerial being, right? And Timothy Morton in Dark Ecology also uses the term fairy in that sense. Aerial in the sense that it is not related to flesh, it's not related to body. It is more like evasive, right? It is as if it doesn't have a body, or not the body, carbon-based body. And ignorance is related to like inaccessibility and representability of a certain domain. And we see it a lot in the Judith Butler's understanding of queer and matter and materiality. And this is quite interesting for me. And the fourth definition is about a critical theory to challenge and break apart conventional categories, as we know it as an deconstructing and deconstructive methodology. And of course, it's a good way to apply it to what we understand from nature and culture and the division between nature and culture. A collection of methodologies to unpick binaries and reread gaps and silences and in-between spaces. So it is a good methodology in how to understand, to go beyond the certain divides. And since we are talking about the divide between artificial and natural and how it is blurred, it is a good way to reconsider queer under that perspective. But I'm going to do it from the perspective of new materialist queer theorists and their criticism of Judith Butler's understanding of queer theory. So, how do we theorize materiality in queer theory then? How do we understand matter, body, and materialization in queer theory? The first reference is, of course, Judith Butler and her influential work. Here I'm going to refer to Bodies That Matter, not Gender Trouble. In Bodies That Matter, she responds to many of the questions brought forward in the Gender Trouble. And most of the new materialist, feminist, and queer contributions emerge from a criticism towards that understanding of performativity and the prevalence of language, linguistic performance, and the position of matter in that performativity theory. So when we take a look at Bodies That Matter, of course, like, it is a dense book, and we have different ways to access it, different means to read it. But we see that it is, at the very beginning, it tries to challenge the division between sex and gender in feminist theory by claiming that such a distinction relies on the conception of a natural, pre-given or given pure body or matter. So here the critic is towards the understanding of when we have the divide between sex and gender. According to her, we rely on a pre-given natural body or matter that is not mediated by cultural inscription. So this is basically her problem, and we will see that for new materialist theorists. In her criticism of the sex-gender divide, she leans towards the other direction. So, like, she's trying to divert our attention from an understanding of a biologically given body or matter, yet she ends up describing matter as or from the perspective of the symbolic inscription or cultural inscription. And this will be a problem for new materialist approaches to queer theory. We will see it in a couple of minutes. But the main argument of the book is that the concept of sex as a pre-linguistic material reality is always already materialized through the filter of certain normative cultural intelligibility grids. This comes from Foucault, of course. Like, for her, so the body, the matter, is a power effect, basically. So accordingly, there is no access to the pre-linguistic materiality of sex without the mediation of symbolic means that guarantee this cultural intelligibility. So basically what she says is that we don't have access to. And like throughout the book, one really tries to understand if this statement is ontological or epistemological. So if there is like, and it is, if this materiality, which is not mediated through subjective signification or cultural inscription, is ontologically or epistemologically inaccessible. And of course, like, she seems not to mean that it is an ontological claim. She says a couple of times that there is a reality ultra beyond, ultra away from, or pre or beyond a cultural inscription. But she says that we don't have access to it without our own signification mechanisms, without cultural intelligibility. So this is going to be a problem, as I told you, in the new materialist understandings of materiality. So what do we mean by saying there is no access? Is it a Kantian premise or a Hegelian premise? So this is also an interesting question, because from time to time she seems to mean that, based on Katerina Kolosov's criticism, as if there's a reality that's more real than that reality. And we have it in Hegel, for instance. And knowing her Hegelian lineage, one can also think that there's something Hegelian out there that believes that the culturally mediated reality, Wirklichkeit, as we call it in Hegelian philosophy, is more real than the reality of things that are considered to be posited outside of the cultural realm, the realm we call Realität in Hegel's terms. So there is also this sense, there's also this take, because from time to time she talks about fiction. When she talks about sex, like, if you're interested, I would refer you to Katerina Kolosova's work, The Cut-Off Reel, and the part on Judith Butler. And she says in general that in postmodern theory we have this understanding that there's a reality that's more real than that reality, than the reality of, so to say, things, or things in themselves, in more Kantian terms. But we don't actually really understand if this is a Kantian or post-Kantian claim, or if it is a more Hegelian claim, but it's a philosophical question. The thing that we really need to understand here is that in her theory of performativity, there's no access to the pre-linguistic material reality that would be unmediated, or linguistically unmediated. If it is an ontological claim, then it would be linguistic nominalism. She seems not to mean that, because a couple of times she mentions that, like a lot of times, not a couple of times, a lot of times she mentions that that's not what she means. But on the other hand, there are certain expressions that she uses which makes us think that it might also be what she intends to say. But this is another discussion. So what is materiality in Judith Butler? What is materialization or segmentation in her terms? I just want you to just check one quotation. I mean, we don't have a lot of time to develop on this a lot, but this, I really like this quotation. And it also, at the end, shows us the maybe even ambiguity in her claim about the accessibility of the material, pre-linguistic material domain. The body, I'm quoting from her, this says, bodies that matter, page 30. The body posited as prior to this sign is always posited or signified as prior. This signification produces as an effect of its own procedure the very body that it nevertheless and simultaneously claims to discover as that which precedes its own action. If the body signified as prior to signification is an effect of signification, then the mimetic or representational status of language, which claims that signs follow bodies as their necessary mirrors, is not mimetic at all. On the contrary, it's productive, constitutive, one might even argue performative, inasmuch as the signifying act delimits and contours the body that it then claims to find prior to any and all signification. This is not to say that the materiality of bodies is simply and only a linguistic effect, which is reducible to a set of signifiers. So this sentence is important. So whenever she makes a similar claim, she then says that it doesn't mean that materiality of bodies is simply a linguistic effect. Such a distinction overlooks the materiality of the signifier itself. Yes, of course. Such an account also fails to understand materiality as that which is bound up with signification from the start. To think through the indissolubility of materiality and signification is no easy matter. To posit by way of language a materiality outside of language is still to posit that materiality. But then again, in the last sentence, we return back to the first premise. To posit by way of language a materiality outside of language is still to posit that materiality. And the materiality so posited will retain that positing as its constitutive condition. This is important, constitutive condition. So positing in language is a constitutive condition for the matter. This part is clear. So what is materiality in Butler then? It is an ontological, is it an ontological or epistemological statement, as I told you? A question tackled by Veronica Westerling in her article in Hypatia. And if it is ontological, it would be linguistic monism. If it is epistemological, then we have no access to it. We are basically in the domain of Kant, right? There are things in themselves, but we don't have access to them. So what does it mean to say that it's the condition of appearance, the language? The linguistic positing is the condition of appearance. So this will be the problem when we take a look at the materialist term. The linguistic utterance being the condition of appearance. So this significance, this importance attributed to language itself, the constitutive role attributed to language itself will be a problem for our new materialist contributors. So materiality is an effect of power. This comes from her reading of Foucault. And language is its condition of appearance. So this is more or less the understanding of materiality in Butler. No access to pure linguistic materiality without the mediation of language. And access here means cultural intelligibility. Cultural intelligibility, which is always an effect of power, which is determined by normativity. So the problem about this understanding of materiality will be tackled by almost all the materialist, queer, and feminist theoreticians. And here there is this book that I really like, Remaking Edited Book, again, Remaking Reality, from Noel Castro and Bruce Brown. And here they utter the problem of this stance from their own perspective. So they say, I'm quoting from them, page 23, quote, between a political desire to open the body to counter hegemonic materializations and a theoretical account that refuses to privilege a prediscursive realm, thereby figuring the materialized body as something defined only negatively through exclusion. This is important. And body is always defined through the term of vulnerability, right? This is related to that. So defined only negatively through exclusion. Butler's account falters precisely at the moment of trying to imagine a side from which the body can be made to matter differently. So the political aim is to be able to get a body that is made to matter differently. But the theoretical tools don't allow us to do that. What is lacking, as Chea suggests, is a recognition of a causal and dynamic relationship between intelligibility and materiality. So this is in general the criticism of the new materialist feminists and queer theorists. The lack of a causal and dynamic relationship between intelligibility and materiality. And that's what they will try to come up with. So when we take a look at the new materialist criticism of Judith Butler's performativity, we see, for instance, like Katerina Kolosova, Vicky Kirby, Vicky Bell, Elizabeth Gross, Karen Barat, like all of them, they all criticize this place of materiality in Butler's theory. Materiality reduced to a power effect, an inaccessible, unrepresentable domain. So Vicky Kirby believes that the body here, and we can think the same of matter and materiality, they are all reduced to a sign. And Katerina Kolosova in 2014 believes that Butler reproduces the distinction between real and unreal, which we see in Western philosophy all the time, as she implies that there is a reality that is more real than the real, the cultural intelligibility. I'm thinking whether it's an Hegelian residue or the Hegelian aspect of her understanding of reality and materiality. It might be. Wikival calls it performism. This is more related to her take of Foucault. And when we call materiality a materialization, so for Butler, materialization is the actualization of difference. This is a quote from Bell. So what Butler calls materialization is the actualization of difference. And difference here means copying hegemonic ideals, the normative ideals, in the normative symbolic order that determines cultural intelligibility, foreclosed under the heteronormative matrix. Sure. So here what we understand from materialization, from segmentation, is the realization or actualization of certain hegemonic ideals, of certain differentiation with respect to the power or with respect to hegemonic ideals. And this gives us very little room to move for novelty, right? This is also another criticism of this understanding of materiality. And another critic, an important critic, I believe, also comes from Vicky Bell. And she says that here, like, what we understand from difference and differentiation is only attributed to cultural inscription. So as if we have an undifferentiated and inaccessible, unrepresentable manifold in terms of Kant, and cultural intelligibility or cultural inscription marks it and differentiates and creates differentiation in it. So like, the question will be, and all of them will ask this question one way or another, especially Vicky Kirby, Elizabeth Gross, of course. Don't we have differentiation already in matter? Doesn't matter differ itself from itself? And or like, this is also related to the understanding of an outside reality as a manifold, undifferentiated manifold. And the differentiations only created as the normative power effect. And this is all very important political implications in Butler's understanding of performativity. But the question is, and the thing is, all the new materialist contributors will say that matter already differentiates itself from itself. It is already evolving, and it's not fixed, and it's not undifferentiated in itself. And there's a continuity between nature and what we call culture. And even Elizabeth Gross and Vicky Kirby say that what we call culture is nature unfolding itself in a different way through human signification. And they use a lot the Deleuzean concept of folding and the media creation. But we will get to that. So there is this quotation from Luciana Parisi, and she says that the emphasis on gender performance in theories of sexual difference and queer sexuality has indeed left the legacy of an inadequate reading of the body sex as a passive container of social cultural techniques of modification. So this is basically the criticism. The body is left to be a sign, and the body sex is construed as merely as a passive container of sociocultural techniques of modification. So this is a problem with this understanding of matter and materialization as an effect of power. So when we take a look at the contributions of new materialist queer feminists about materializations, we basically see a legacy of Deleuze-Guattari and Deleuze-Guattari's understanding of virtual and actual and actualization, We see abundance of references to Bergson, especially Elizabeth Gross, Luciana Parisi, and Claire Colebrook refer to virtual actual access developed by Gilles Deleuze with reference to Bergson. This is understandable because, as Vicky Bell says, there is a certain performism in the understanding of matter in Butler. So, like, the best way to I think, like, one of the best ways to get over performism in philosophy is to refer to virtuality, virtual actual access in those Guattari and Bergson. So they do that. They say that the virtual, the domain of, so the actualization is not only the actualization of a potential. This would be a certain way of saying performism or forms precede matter. And materialization is the actualization of certain forms that precede matter. Against that idea, virtual actual access says that there is a virtual pre-individual domain from where the substance and substances or subject-object positions emerge. So here we refer to a relational domain, an affective domain, also in those Guattari's terms, a pre-individual domain of intensities in those Guattarian terms, and we might call it differently based on different perspectives. But what is important is a pre-individual domain, which is virtual domain, which is as real as the actualized materiality. This is important. And one of the other emphasis is that matter already differentiates itself from itself. What we understand from biology, what we understand from matter is not a fixed domain ready to be culturally inscribed. It differentiates itself from itself. It is already laden with differences, and sexual difference is just one of them. It's a vital difference and a motor of evolution, according to Elizabeth Gross. And Vicky Bell instead refers to ethno-ecological assemblages. Assemblage is again a concept coming from Deleuze-Guattari. And assemblage means, like, there's always this understanding. The concept of assemblage is developed in Mille Plateaux, in 1,000 Plateaus, especially in the chapter where they criticize a certain understanding of semiology as being merely linguistic. So this is important. Also, this is important in the criticisms against Judith Butler's theory of performativity, which is very much linguistic. So they again and again mention linguistic semiology as only one mode of semiology, and they mention different ways of different understandings of semiology. And assemblage here is introduced as a hybridity, as an intermingling between a material form and an expressive form. And throughout the work of Deleuze and Guattari, we see that they are trying to come up with a certain understanding of hybridity between matter and significance, matter and sense, which would also respect their irreducibility to one another. And so this is a very important and very basic task of Deleuze and Guattarian philosophy. And the concept of assemblage refers to that. And later on, they will also refer to Spinoza in affect politics and effects as assemblages. So, new materialist queer-feminist conceptions of materialization. Another example is Miriam Hurd, and she, quoting from Parisi, challenges the naturalness of nature by highlighting the unfamiliar, non-assumable forces of nature itself. So here, what is important, and we get to see certain readings in queer theory going back to nature and trying to justify non-normative sexual orientations and sexual identities in the human world based on the nature itself, saying that, okay, we already have it in nature. So Maya Hurd opposes this understanding, and she says that why do we look for justification in nature? Why do we turn to nature to justify the naturalness or the acceptability, let's say, of non-normative ways of being in our symbolic system. So she says that instead what we need to do is to challenge the naturalness of nature, the very naturalness of nature, by highlighting the unfamiliar forces of nature itself. And this is also quite close to the concept of nature working against itself in mid-plateau, in 1,000 plateaus in Belouizdar. And they say that nature works against itself. So when we consider the differentiation itself in nature and nature in matter, differentiating from itself, this forms better, for new materialist accounts, a better ontological premise to understand the continuity between what we call nature and culture. For instance, she mentions the bacterial genomes trading genes without any respect for the heterological sexual reproduction at the core of species boundaries. And also she emphasizes on the use of technology by non-human living organisms. And Vicky Kirby also works a lot on that. She works a lot on the non-human technologies and the way, and also like in many respects, she says that our technologies imitate and mimic them. And like when we take a look at CRISPR-Cas9 technology, for instance, the gene editing technology, it is inspired by the by bacteria and their gene editing. They're not gene editing, but gene maybe swapping to survive. So she says that the so-called human technologies actually mimic technology already invented and invested in by other species. And she says that we may no longer be certain that it is nature that remains static and culture that evinces limitless malleability. So this is the main problem. When we take a look at, again, when we just remind ourselves of what we said when we were talking about Judith Butler and her understanding of Foucault, it is as if the differentiation comes from the cultural inscription itself, and it's always already the effect of the power, the normativity. And here we want to understand a nature that is already as malleable as cultural inscription is, and it's not static. And we also witness that in Elizabeth Gross, an understanding of matter, an understanding of biology that's not static, and a means to understand evolution and Darwinian evolution with respect to that matter's differentiation from itself. This is another important theme in new materialist accounts. So we mentioned the material turn, and of course, in general, the materialist philosophy, and which is also quite feminist in itself, is a response to the cultural turn, as we call it in social sciences. And starting from 1990s, the end of 1980s, maybe, we actually witness the proliferation of theories that rely on the social constructivism, or radical social constructivism. I mean, all the new materialists, and also Donna Haraway, which is an important and influential figure for new materialist theorists, they all believe that social constructivism in itself has been useful for us to understand how what we deem to be natural as, or might in certain ways constitute it. But they believe that now this episteme, this maybe paradigm, started to consume itself. Especially Katerina Kolosova says that this was a paradigm, but it started to consume itself, and we need to, and now we feel the need to come up with more materialist understandings of differentiation, of matter, of body, of effect. And that's the reason why maybe starting from 2000s and maybe throughout the last decade, we have more materialist accounts of differentiation, difference, and identity. And according to Vicky Kirby, for instance, the cultural turn in social theory has for long emphasized hermeneutic circles. So we see it in Lacan's bar of prohibition, we see it in Frederick Jameson's prison house of language. We say it in Michel Foucault's no outside of language, and Derrida's no outside of text. Of course, we have new readings of Derrida which align better with new materialist accounts. But like there's this unease in all those theories of social constructivist theories, there's an unease about naturalizing arguments. And this is also quite understandable for feminism. This is also quite understandable for the need of a term called as gender in feminist studies. And Stacy Alaimo, in her book The Nature Unbounded, mentions that, like, for long the feminist theory used social constructivist accounts to denaturalize certain conceptions, certain biodeterministic conceptions, and this was useful. Donna Haraway, also in her article about situated knowledge, mentions that for long this was the social constructivist accounts were used to counter naturalization of gender stereotypes. And this is understandable in feminist theory because most of the time the patriarchal stereotypes and the subjugation of women are justified by using naturalized arguments, are justified by naturalizing certain stereotypes, certain behaviors deemed to be naturally female or naturally feminine. And most of the feminist theory is devoted to counter those arguments, and social constructivism proved to be a useful tool to do that. And then, but it also created a certain sense of disregard towards matter, disregard towards biology. Elizabeth Cross mentions it in her book Volatile Bodies. Vicky Kirby tackles with this stance in feminist theory in her book. So, like, according to her, I'm quoting from Kirby, from Confounding the Human, Incestuous Beginnings. According to most critical theories, nature is prescriptive by definition. Nature is ineffable. It is that state of primordial life that precedes language and to which access is denied. And if it lacks the capacity to speak, then in truth, it must be unrepresentable. Any sign of nature, inasmuch as it is a sign, will always already be a cultural interpretation. In short, nature as such is absent from the representation itself. So this is a very short, brief summary of what the hermeneutical circle, how the hermeneutical circle deems nature, granting it unrepresentability, granting it non-differentiation. And when we take a look at Stacy Alaimo in Undomesticated Ground, the book before the Bodily Natures, she explains that an urge to rebel against biological determinism that led feminism to, quoting from her, try to disentangle women from nature. But we also see eco-critical and ecofeminist contributions that try to re-establish a relationship between the two, and we are also seeing re-naturalization attempts in feminist theory. By going back to Spinoza, for instance, we see it in Hassana Sharp in her book about renaturalization of philosophy, and she mentions how that stance, that renaturalization attempt, referring to Spinoza, might be helpful for feminist theory. But in general, the rebelling against biological determinism, which was also quite useful and necessary for women's movement, led feminism to try to disentangle women from nature, women from body, from effect. And I'm also quoting from her again, human corporeality, especially female corporeality, has been so strongly associated with nature in Western thought that it is not surprising that feminism has been haunted not only by the specter of nature as the repository of essentialism, but by, as Linda Burke puts it, the ghost of biology. She charges that the underlying assumption that some aspects of biology are fixed becomes itself the ground narrative, albeit implicit, from which feminists and other social theorists are trying to escape. So the social constructivism has helped women's movements in feminist theory to escape from that biologism, which is biological essentialism and biological determinism. But it also, in a certain way, it also contributed to that understanding of materiality as only as the mere power effect. And it also diminished, mitigated, if not already destroyed, the capacity of matter and a material becoming as a potential political struggle site. So Stacy Alaimo underlines how theorists in political ecology already criticize social constructivism's conception of nature. But yeah, for some time, and throughout the last decade especially, we also see in political ecology a certain criticism against social constructivists' accounts of nature. And for instance, David Kintner's essay in environmental ethics, and this is from Stacy Alaimo's Bodily Natures, the book called Bodily Natures. David Kintner, for instance, in his environmental ethics, discusses that social constructionism, quoting, colludes with commercialism in the long-term industrial project of replacing the natural by the artifactual, defining a form of human existence which claims independence from natural processes and rhythms. Social constructivism therefore provides a model of nature which fits seamlessly into the industrialist view of the world. So Kintner establishes a relationship between a certain complicity between social constructivism and industrialist view of the world. And I mean, this is also understandable when we take a look at how the biotechnologies are used by the industry itself, and how, as Rosie Braidotti mentions, advanced capitalism or late capitalism or cognitive capitalism, or nowadays maybe we can say digital or post-digital capitalism, also relies on all this understanding of nature as a repository of human augmentation. And we see all those transhumanist attempts to augment body, to see body and flesh as mere repository of human consciousness. So we see this highly Cartesian understanding of mind and body, also quite complicit in late capitalism and the way it becomes posthumous, right? Another reference for Stacy Alaimo is Charles Scott in his book called The Lives of Things. He criticizes the word nature in part because the meaning of the word, quoting from him, often draws us to an abstracting process rather than to the lives of things in their non-discursive, dynamic interactions. And again, Lawrence Brill mentions eco-criticism, and he says that eco-criticism must develop modes of analysis that do not continue to emphasize the disjunction between text and world. And we also see that in the Capitalocene analysis of Jason Moore. He mentions that, of course, from a Marxist perspective, he mentions that how this understanding of nature, and he calls it the green arithmetics, this understanding of nature has actually been constituted as the repository of capitalist accumulation process, and he calls it the cheap nature and the cheapening of both nature and human labor. So this understanding of nature as a blank slate or as a repository of cultural inscription indeed helped or just provided the main ground for capitalist accumulation and for the industry, for the big industry, big biotechnological industry itself. And Rosie Braidotti is quite keen to more ethically analyze this situation, this posthumous situation, which is also promoted by advanced capitalism, by cognitive capitalism, or biogenetic capitalism. So just to sum up, now we are seeing that all those interventions also in environmental humanities, as we call it, the discipline, and there are ongoing intersections between queer theory, new materialism, and environmental humanities and eco-criticism. And the understanding of nature, the understanding of the way we posit nature, what we understand from materiality, what we understand from matter, is at the heart of that discussion. And I just wanted to give you a brief picture of how queer theory in itself develops, and how different stances, different new materialist stances in queer theory oppose the cultural turn, oppose radical social constructivism, and oppose the performativity of Judith Butler. And one of the names, and I now want to mention only Karen Barat and her intervention to queer theory and her intervention to performativity, and she develops the idea of performativity in a different vein and under different premises, and she calls it agential realism. And the main understanding, the main thing in her philosophy is also the positing of a pre-individual domain from which subject and object positions emerge. And this relational ontology, we call it, and this is what we witness also in actor network theory, in science and technology studies, in Bourdieu's criticism of body as a substance. So we now turn our attention to how subject and object positions evolve from agential interactions. And here, like, we see the criticism of Karen Barat towards that understanding of matter and materiality as a mere repository of cultural inscription. And she says, I'm quoting her, matter is not little bits of nature or a blank slate or sight passively awaiting signification, nor is it an uncontested ground for scientific, feminist, or Marxist theories. Matter is not immutable nor passive, nor is it a fixed support, location, referent, or source of sustainability for discourse. So she also, in all her work, she also criticizes the great deal of attention we have paid to language, to linguistics, to also even to understanding materiality as a mere power effect. And she turns our attention to understanding matter and sense emerging within the same process and in the interactive practices in phenomena itself. So when we take a look at agential realism, we see that she is trying to propose an ontology, a relational ontology, in which we don't actually see the interaction between already established substances. So she rather tries to understand how the substance in itself is supported, reiterated, formed, and emerged from a pre-individual or pre-substantial domain. And she revisits the performativity theory in Butler from that perspective. So Karen Barat's agential realism envisages the emergence of both matter and meaning within phenomena. So they are embedded in phenomena and they emerge through different interactions, through different practices. This is a relational domain wherein subject and object positions are the result and not the cause of interactions, agential practices and performances. When we take a look at the concept of interaction, we see that it is a response to the concept of interaction. Interaction envisages or just believes that there are already established substances. So we have already established substances and we have interactions between them. And it is like we have already established divisions between subject and object. We have already established natural domain and cultural domain, and then we have interactions between the two of them. Rather, she wants us to understand, and also she's a physicist, and she has developed that understanding and that idea from her reading of quantum physics and more. She rather proposes that matter and meaning are emerging realities and are emerging entities from and preceding domain of phenomena. Phenomena here do not refer to what we understand phenomena in Kant, for instance. It is not appearance to human subject or transcendental ego. It is rather the relational domain wherein subject and object positions are the result of the emerging qualities from that domain, and this is the domain of agential practices and performances, and this is an understanding of the double slit experiment in quantum physics and what we have come to call indeterminacy, and how the experimental approaches itself determines the result, and how the observer position and the existence of an observer position changes the apparatus itself altogether. Also, this is an advanced understanding of materiality, as Zizek also puts it. So Parisi has a very interesting and very useful interpretation of Karen Barrett's agential realism. I'm quoting from her. By reworking Butler's performing bodies to include non-human material agencies involved in the process of active and not just discursive materialization of a body sex, Barrett proposes a concept of performance beyond its assumed anthropomorphic limitations. So according to Parisi, this is a reworking on Butler's performing bodies. But the way she does it is to include non-human material agencies also involved in the process of the active materialization of a body sex. And this materialization is no longer a merely discursive practice or a mere power effect. This is also the non-human material agency involved. And also the non-human material agency is involved in that materialization process. So this performance is quite different than the performance understood in Butler's terms, and which was, in a certain sense, anthropomorphic. Thus, matter is not delimited to the linguistic or discursive acts or to the human-centered vision of the organic body. So here we see that the new materialist theorists give us a certain understanding of overcoming biological determinism, yet understanding materialization also as a differentiation of matter from itself, and understanding materialization not just a discursive, not just as a discursive process. So here we have a material semiotic, as we call it, understanding of the relationship between matter and discourse and matter and meaning. And Karen Barrett calls reality as like reality is not composed of things in themselves or things behind phenomena, but things in phenomena. So according to her, both things and also meaning is within phenomena. They are emerging realities out of the phenomena, and the phenomena changes once the intra-active practices change. Both matter and meaning emerge in agential interactions. So here the term agential means that the quality of being an agent, the quality of agency is not limited to human subjectivity, and the relations themselves are agents in the process. And both matter and meaning emerge in intra-activities of phenomena. So it's a process embedded in phenomena. This is also her interpretation of the double-slit experiment in quantum physics. And this is a material account of performativity, rather a material semiotic account of performativity. Again, when we take a look at Percy believes that this is the way we can analyze technoscience and the intervention or the mediation, the technoscientific mediation of what we deem to be natural. And I really find it quite inspiring in that sense. It's inspiring in the sense that we don't fall back to biological determinism, but we have a whole better means to understand matter and materialization. I'm quoting from Parisi. If the impact of technoscience on the ontology of sexual difference and queer sexuality has to be taken seriously, that is causally, beyond its mere textual effects, then it may be helpful to develop a philosophical concept of relationality that derives not from technoscience, but that engages in a speculative fashion with technoscientific experimentations in matter. So maybe to sum up or to conclude this part, I can say that this approach to technoscience, this approach to material semiotics might be useful in our analysis of all those technologies. And Luciana Parisi also does that when it comes to nanotechnologies and nanobots. And now I would like to shift to Natasha Myer. I have like half an hour, but let's take like 5 or 10 minutes of not a break, but a question and answer session. If like anyone would like to add something, say something, and then we can shift to Natasha Myer's experimental anthropology, ethnography. As a different way of analysis, in the, as she calls it, Plantocene era. I talked so much. There are questions or remarks on the chat.
I have a question.
Yeah, please. And if you can turn on your camera again, thank you.
What does Barad make a distinction between agency as practical autonomy in the Kantian sense and agency as material inert processes?
As far as I know, no. And this is the whole point, I think, like not differentiating between the two. And also I know that Zizek criticizes that understanding and less than nothing. And he says that we need to differentiate between the two, and we need to differentiate the sense-making and signification process of humans. Yeah, but there is this criticism towards her. But like I think the whole point of her analysis is that type of a, as we might call it, flat ontology. She talks about agency and agential realism in the sense that both meaning and matter emerge within the phenomena, and she doesn't make the distinction. But this is a like ongoing criticism, or like not a criticism, but an intervention to her theory. I think Felix also criticizes nematerialism from that perspective, right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
One of my main concerns was actually this, because it seems to me like any anti-capitalist project, insofar as it understands capitalism as precisely a historical phenomenon, needs to account for subjective agency as some kind of practical autonomy that is not, even if it is included in nature, that is not practically reducible to it.
Yeah, I think this is a quite like valid criticism, and I'm also like reading all those criticisms from a different perspective, and I think it's quite valid. Yeah, I mean, like there must be, or like the criticism is basically there must be a difference anyhow between the signification process of human subjects. Otherwise, it would be also difficult to come up with a political agenda, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? If not, we can also shift to a different perspective or a different way of doing ethnography or anthropology. Natasha Myers. I also want us to be able to practice that kriya. So, yeah, Gözde. Connections. Yeah, I would like to pose a question about intelligibility and its roots in Plato. I believe the difference between intelligibility and sensibility is isomorphic with cultural intelligibility.
Can you also read it out, or I can read it loud, because YouTube you cannot see the question.
Yeah, it's true. I can read it. I would like to pose a question about intelligibility and its roots in Plato. I believe the difference between the intelligible and sensible is isomorphic with cultural intelligibility and the idea that some are more real than others. Do you think that it's something to pursue? Yeah. I think I'm like in terms of Butler, I mostly had Hegel in mind, but of course we can trace it back to Plato. And I mean, of course, like Hegel is more Aristotelian in that sense. I think like maybe Butler would be more in line with the Aristotelian and Hegelian lineage. But anyhow, yeah, it is of course something to pursue. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm also checking the YouTube part, so you can also write your questions from YouTube chat, and we can read it if there's any.
Yeah.
Maybe
if not,
Natasha Myer.
Yeah, if not, we can go on with Natasha Myers. I really like it because it is also a different perspective in a different way, different means to make ethnography and anthropology. So, like, if you take a look at also her project, the Botanic Sensoria, and their practices, basically, they practice-based and experience and experiment-based anthropology and ethnography. And she proposes an alternative anthropological and ethnographic methodology that relies on attunement to botanic sensoria rather than observation or calculation or measurement. So, like, the basic thing is here, the basic emphasis is working on the sensibility, the our own sensibility, and changing it maybe close to the terms of Rancière. And here the term conservation, and she's also working a lot on nature conservation. Here the term conservation mostly becomes attunement, and it no longer means protecting that which lies outside the subject or that which is out there to be protected from some human intervention, malign human intervention, but it is mostly like attunement and changing the sensibility, our own sensibility. And it is rather this very attunement that creates new modalities of sensing together and the entanglement between nature culture. And we can see that in her project and every aspect of her project. And I really propose you to take a look at that. And it is also, it's related to working on our senses, including sound, smell, and also the practice itself. And this kriya is written as part of that project. It is like kriya in Sanskrit means completed action, as I said at the beginning. And it is like mostly kriyas are like practices with breathing, and you can also use sounds like mantra, and they are physical movements, all of them, and at the end of which they aim is to have a different modality, different in body and mind. So I really like to experiment on those experimental anthropological tools. Adolfo Estrella, for instance, I think now he's in Madrid. He is also working on experimental ethnography, and he's working on the concept of sensibility with also reference to Rancière. And in my PhD thesis, I was also inspired from him. Effect theory is also a useful tool in that sense. And in my thesis, for instance, it was useful for me to understand how becoming works in given moments, or in those type of moments when our relations with the space, when our relations with effective and sensible effective relations with space and with each other changed. And he also works on assemblies in 15M in Spain, and he calls that the assembly in itself is a different way of relating to space itself. And he mentions the change of rhythm in life, the change of, and also I witnessed it in my own empirical work, my own thesis, like the assembly itself, the rhythm of the assembly changes the rhythm of the body and the way we interact and the way we interact with others. And there was an architect, for instance, and she was very much used to the professional life, as we call it. And she told me in an interview that in an assembly, an assembly was like unsupportable for her. She couldn't bear it, and she couldn't even sit in an assembly because everything was so slow for her. And like everything from like not being able to take decisions and like discussing something again and again, all the slowness, and everything was so against her habit or her habitual way of doing work in her professional life, that it was unbearable for her, and her body was resisting, and she was bored, and she was unable to follow. And then in time she said that she got used to that, and she got the idea that the idea was not to come up with a decision, and maybe the process itself, the very slowness itself, is a means of making politics and changing the very sensibility itself. So I was already interested in this aspect of politics, in this aspect of like becoming to effective changes, becoming to those moments when our relations with each other, when our relations with space change. And then afterwards, when I also took a look at Natasha Myer's work, I had that understanding that she's also working on a similar line and trying to change the very sensibility, and also like using the term attunement instead of conservation, or like having this problem with the term of conservation, also I think talks to all those criticisms against this understanding of nature in environmental politics, as I mentioned. And I also consider her work in that lineage, more or less. So I wanted this part to have a more practical, a more Kriya-based sense, and we can maybe close our session with that. And this is a Kriya, and it is called Sensing Botanical Sensoria, a Kriya for cultivating your inner plant. And just try to consider it as a way of changing, or trying to change at least, the very sensibility and the way we do the effective an effective means of understanding botanical sensoria, as she calls it. So I'm going to read it, and I want you to try to just meditate on it. It might be a little bit unusual because it's not something we generally do in theoretical sessions, but it's also, I think, a means for experiment and experimenting for us. So I'm going to read it. I'm going to try to read it as best as I can do, based on my yoga education, which I have a little bit distanced myself from recently with the pandemic. So if you're ready, I'm going to start it. Never forget this. Your body does not end at the skin. Your contours are not constrained by physical appearance. Your morphology imaginary is fluid and changeable. Indeed, your tissues can absorb all kinds of fantasies. Your imagination generates more than mere mental images. Its reach extends through your entire sensorium. Simultaneously visual and kinesthetic, imaginings carry an effective charge. They can excite your muscles, tissues, and fascia, heighten or alter your senses. You can fold semiosis into sensation. Perceptual experiments can re-articulate your sensorium. And by imagining otherwise and telling different stories, you can open up new sensible worlds. Consider tying on the habits, comportments, and sensitivities of other bodies. Becoming with and alongside others, you might begin to see with new eyes, smell with a new nose, and taste with a new tongue. Indeed, we have opportunities to do this every day in our entangled mimetic dances with others, human, more than human, and machine. These encounters can incite other ways of seeing, feeling, and knowing. Altered perceptions can destabilize entrenched sensory regimes and bring otherwise imperceptible phenomena within grasp. What you once thought were stable boundaries between bodies may begin to break down. The very order of things may come undone. Consider this as an invitation to deepen your already multi-species yoga practice. Cat, cow, dog, crow, scorpion, and fish poses. Torque your body into mimetic affinities with animal forms. And here I invite you to cultivate your inner plant. This is not an exercise in anthropomorphism, a rendering of plants on the model of the human. Rather, it is an opportunity to vegetalize your already more than human body. In order to awaken the latent plant in you, you will need to get interested and involved in the things that plants care about. Follow the plants. Let yourself be lured by their tropic turns, and you will acquire freshly vegetalized sensory dexterities. Try this Kriya. 3 poses will never be the same again. Find a patch of sunlight. Stand tall. Let your feet sink into the ground below you, and close your eyes. Reach your bare arms outward and feel the sun warm your skin. Drink it in. Now, let go of your bodily contours. The skin and flesh of your arms thins and fans outward, becoming membrane thin. Your bones dissolve and your muscles melt away. Begin to pump water through your veins until they elongate and branch into turgid vessels. Draw water up your growing stem into your leaves. Play with this new buoyancy. Feel the lift and lilt as your leaves and stems reach for more sunlight. You are becoming phototropic. Lap up the sunlight through your greening leaves. Feel the cool packet of air forming on the underside of your leaves as you release atmospheric vapors. You are photosynthesizing, eating sunlight, inhaling gaseous carbon, exhaling oxygen, and releasing water. Now, drop down into your 2 roots. Extend yourself into the cool, moist earth. Feel your strength as a downward thrust that inspires an upward lift. Experiment with gravitropism. Feel the rush as you redistribute your awareness through this thin, filigreed tangle of roots and that branch and branch until they reach the width of just a single cell. Find one of your root tips. Taste the wet, metallic soil. Smell that musty gradient of decaying matter flush with nitrogen and phosphorus. Propel yourself towards the source. Experiment with your strength. Push yourself up against the soil. Grow through minute crevices between crumbling pieces of earth. Wherever the soil resists, just release your chemical stores to dissolve whatever is in your path. Now multiply this sensation. Feel 2 searching root tips, then 4. Can you extend your awareness to 5? What would it like to feel 1,000 root tips extending through the soil? Feel the rush as you expand your awareness to millions of sensitive root tips. Dive downwards and run outwards, drawing water and nutrients in and up through all of them simultaneously. Feel your whole root system humming with an electric charge. You have become one giant nerve cell merging with soil. Now hook yourself into the thickening mycelial network of fungi, microbes, and other roots all around you. Feel the energetic thrill of connection. How far can you extend your awareness? Run with it in every direction. Without letting go of this excitation, draw your awareness back up your stem and into your leaves. You no longer have eyes, a nose, ears, a tongue, or nerves, but that doesn't mean you can't see, smell, hear, speak, taste, or feel. Can you feel the play of light and shadow across your leaves? The surface of each one of your leaves is a visual organ registering and remembering minute shifts, light intensity. And you can see in color, indeed, a wider range of colors than your human eyes have ever beheld. You don't need a central nervous system to process this information into images. Your leaves are filmic media, recording color movies of the lush, shifting light patterns around you. You can see the dancing shadows that other plants cast as they list and play in the wind. And you can tell that the person standing over you about to prune your limbs is wearing a red shirt. Experiment with light at dawn and dusk. Can you feel the energetic shift when the far red light of the rising and setting sun cruise your body into the Earth's rotational rhythms? In time, you will be able to remember precisely when those long rays last excited your tissues. You will not only acquire a bodily memory of the play of light and color as they change over the seasons, you will learn to anticipate and prepare for future events. Continue this practice daily, and you will no longer need a nose to smell or a mouth to speak. Your entire body will become an olfactory organ, sniffing out the richly fragrant world around you. Indeed, the atmosphere is a collaborative ecology of volatile chemical signals, to which you actively and volubly contribute. Take pleasure in the art of synthesizing and releasing complex bouquets of fragrance from your tissues. This is your way of telling the world that you are up to moment. You can talk to other plants and animals, reporting on the condition of your leaves, flowers, and fruits. You will be able to lure pollinators and complain audibly about the damage done by feeding insects. Indeed, you not only feel insects crawling up your stem and slicing into your tissues. You can discern the distinct species eating your leaves by tasting the specific chemistry of its saliva. If you are quick, you can synthesize volatile compounds to warm your neighbors so that they can prepare their tissues with toxins to keep the offending insects at bay. Or you could call out for help from other insects who will prey on these herbivores. Soon, you will discover that you are an effusive catalyst at the center of an effectively charged chemical ecology. Now it's time to let go. Draw in your roots until your rhizome remembers its feet. Let your leaves thicken into arms. Feel your turgid vessels soften. Drop your arms back down to your sides. Come back to your breath. Come back to your body, but remember to ask yourself, is this really the same body? What has changed? Thank you. So, what have you thought about it? What do you think about this practice, or what do you think about this experimental ethnography? I hope I didn't read too fast. I was a bit worried about time, the time that we have, but we still have 10 more minutes to discuss.
Yes, it seems like it can be, the emotions can change according to the reader.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the reader's performance is also really important. It wasn't so good, but there are people who are really, really trained to do this better than me. And maybe experimenting with them would be better.
Yeah, but I think that each time is unique, you know. We just from you, so we experience your way of understanding it. So thank you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give a glimpse of what new experimental ethnographies might mean. And I also wanted to give an example to how we can come up with different ethnographies and different anthropologies to attune with the botanic sensoria, as Natasha Myer calls it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it can be a good way to approach this. Also, like there's always this problem of the anthropological difference, the difference of cultural signification, the difference of this rupture that we call, that is created by language. And of course, there's the different signification process that is always at work here. But what is important in all those new materialist understandings is that trying to understand that the whole process is material semiotic, and one approach, like logical positivist approach, leaned towards the empirical content, as they called it. But then the social constructivist approach leans towards the other direction a little bit too much, maybe. And maybe we came to understand that all the matter itself is only a power effect. So all those contributions like want us to better construe the entanglement and the active role of matter itself. Because Karen Barrett also like famously says that matter also feels, matter also and also, when we take a look at Vicky Kirby's contributions, she also mentions a language in the nature itself, and she also mentions technologies, non-human technologies, and how human technologies are also inspired by them again and again. And I gave the example of CRISPR-Cas9 technology, and it's a very good example because it's inspired by bacteria themselves. So maybe all those theorists want to understand, like apart from Karen Barrett, she has a different understanding of matter and meaning, but Elizabeth Gross, Vicky Kirby, and Luciana Paris, they want us to consider culture in continuation with nature. And following those criteria, we can understand our own mechanism of signification as just another way of folding our milieu and making home out of that. And this is always in an entangled relationship with materiality. And this was just a call to return back to matter, to nature in a different way, and to reconsider what we understand from unrepresentable nature or inaccessible nature. And I think this is also quite in line with the topic of the festival, this post-digital ignorance. And when we talk about ignorance, we talk about like unintelligibility a lot. And how do we become more and more intermingled with the material world, with technology, with digital subjectivation, as we call it. And yet how does this understanding, how does this mediation, how does this interminglement lead us to new ways of unintelligibility, unrepresentability. And I just wanted to contribute to that theme based on more like new materialist understandings of materialization and nature, because I think we have come to talk more about what happens to us at the end of or as a result of this mediation. Especially with the pandemic, we have relied more and more on technologies or also on this mediation. I mean, like normally we shouldn't be doing this like online, right? We should be doing this like, physically, like seeing each other, being able to touch each other. So like the more we have the results of this Anthropocene, like pandemics and all those type of new ways of like the virus activation is a new way of activation of nature, as we call it, right? So like the more we become intermingled, the more we blur the lines between artificial and natural, the more we will have the intensification of the activity of matter itself as well, non-human matter itself. And pandemic, the virus, is an example of this. So the more we blur the boundaries between species, the more we will have different and new types of viruses being activated. So I think it's a good way to think about this, blurry lines and what happens to us as well. So as a result of the increasing digitalization and increasing entanglement with our own technologies. Mm-hmm. I talk too much.
Do you have water with you? Yes, and do you remember at the beginning of this meetings for just making the program with the creator Ebru Yetişkin and other participants, we were talking about the ignorance and how we can translate the title post-digital ignorance to Turkish, because we were really questioning which ignorance we are talking about at the end.
Yeah.
And yes, there are like many phases of ignorance. Ones that we neglect to learn, or the ones that we don't really learn.
No. Yeah, and then we decided to include all those connotations, right? Like the unintelligibility and like all the things, all the connotations that come to our minds when we talk about ignorance.
Yes, and it was quite long.
Yeah, so throughout the festival, we will be like developing more on all those connotations of ignorance, right?
Yes. So, thank you very much. If there is other contributions, we can hear you. You can write. If not, we can close this session little by little. Thank you for being with us, Öznur.
Thank you.
I try to help you with the names of the researchers, artists, and it was quite a list, long list. It was for me like a great big introduction to the topic. And tomorrow at the amberNetworkFestival's program, there will be Kavun Aktif from Casablanca, and they will work on the decolonization of arts with very and it will be like 2 sessions, not only 1 session, 2 sessions. So the first one, don't miss. You can follow on the Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook accounts of Amber Platform and Amber Network Platform. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be happy to. Have a nice festival.
Yes, you too.
Tamam. Çıkıyorum o zaman.
You're next.